Right, good evening everybody. I'm assuming that most people here tonight know at least something about the Brontes' lives. So I'm going to mainly be talking about things that happened after their deaths and talking about the work of the Brontë Parsonage Museum, where I've been working for 34 years, so nearly longer. I've been there nearly longer than the Brontes. So the Brontes' enduring popularity can be partly explained by the power and the originality of the books that they wrote. But on top of that, there's also their life histories, which has got so many fascinating components. And it's easy to understand why they're such an object of fascination. So there's the remarkable literary achievement of the three daughters of a Yorkshire parson who went on to produce some of the greatest books in the English language. There's the wild moorland landscape of their home at Haworth. There's the intense imaginary worlds they created in childhood. There's the story of their brilliant but doomed brother, and of course the tragically early deaths. The Brontes have exerted a powerful hold over our collective imaginations for over 170 years. Generations of readers, writers and artists have been absorbed and inspired by them. The novelist Elizabeth Gaskell produced the first of many Bronte biographies. Her best-selling book, The Life of Charlotte Bronte, was published in 1857, 2 years after the death of its subject. So with so much early interest in the Brontes, it was inevitable, I think, that Haworth became a destination for literary pilgrimage, and the family's home, the parsonage at Haworth. And also, Gaskell's biography created a market for relics of the famous family. And the Reverend Patrick Bronte lived long enough to witness the kind of beginnings of tourism in Haworth. He outlived his wife and all 6 of his children. And he would often be sought out at the parsonage by admirers of his daughter's works. And we know that he would often cut Charlotte's letters into snippets to meet the many requests he received for samples of her handwriting. Following Patrick Bronte's death in 1861, his son-in-law, Arthur Bell Nichols, inherited all the Bronte family's surviving possessions. He'd come to Haworth as Mr. Bronte's curate and had lived at the parsonage following his marriage to Charlotte in 1854, which lasted only 9 months. Charlotte died in the early stages of pregnancy. The contents of the parsonage, including many of the Brontes' books, were sold at auction, and the original handwritten sale catalogue struggling to move it on. There we go. It's all right, it's done. So this is the catalogue for the 1861 sale. And over 2 days, most of the Brontes' everyday household items were sold. For museum staff, this catalogue is very, very frustrating. It will just give you the briefest details. It lists box of old books, and we want to know what books, what editions, and you just don't get that information. But one thing you do get is often the name of the purchaser, which has been quite valuable in trying to trace the provenance of an item. An American called Charles Hale, who was one of many that were inspired to visit Haworth after reading Gaskell's biography, arrived shortly after the sale had taken place, and he was very disappointed to have missed the chance to purchase a piece of Brontiana. And in a letter that he wrote home to his mother, he writes, Mr. Nichols, in going away, took nearly everything of special value or interest which had belonged to his wife. But the remaining household effects were disposed of by public auction about 3 weeks ago. But Hale didn't leave Haworth empty-handed, however. His visit coincided with the refurbishment of the parsonage in preparation for Patrick Bronte's successor. And Hale was able to carry back to America the wire and crank of Mr. Bronte's bell pull and the whole lower sash of Charlotte Bronte's bedroom window. And these were like holy relics. He carried them back to America. So it seems that nothing was considered too unworthy of acquisition. But of course, it was manuscripts and books which were considered the trophy items for collectors. And all the main collectors of Brontiana in this period were powerful, wealthy men. And although still collectible, items like needlework boxes, samplers, watercolour paintings, fabric taken from dresses worn by the Bronte sisters, they were considered of less importance in the kind of collecting hierarchy of importance. So after Mr. Bronte's death, his son-in-law, Arthur Bell Nichols, returned to Ireland. This is a photograph of Arthur Bell Nichols. He'd not been offered the post of minister at Haworth after Mr. Bronte's death. So he gave up the church and became a gentleman farmer in Ireland. And he carried back to Ireland with him as many manuscripts and mementos of his wife as he could carry. So the years passed, and into the story steps Clement King Shorter, a journalist on the Illustrated London News who'd written an introduction to a cheap edition of Jane Eyre and who planned to write a full-scale biography of the family. He sought out Charlotte Bronte's close friend, Ellen Nussey, who owned a large collection of nearly 500 letters written by Charlotte Bronte, which he hoped to make use of in his book. And at the time that she met Shorter, Ellen Nussey was 75 years of age, and she was in frail health and living in genteel poverty. She worried about the future preservation of her letters, and Shorter came up with what seemed to be the ideal solution. And he recommended that she sell the letters to his friend Thomas James Wise, who was an extremely well-connected book dealer. He was a bibliographer and a very well-respected book collector. He would make the letters available to Shorter for his biography, and he offered Ellen an assurance that her important letters would be destined for a national collection. So Ellen gratefully accepted his offer, along with a cheque for £125. If you think about the prices that change hands now for Bronte material on the market, it seems quite pitiful. So Shorter gained access to the content of the letters, and his friend Thomas James Wise acquired the originals. But Shorter knew that if he wanted to publish the letters, he needed the permission of Arthur Bell Nichols, who was the copyright owner. So Nichols was tracked down to Hill House at Banagher in Ireland, where he'd set up home. He married his cousin Mary Bell, and he lived a quiet, retiring life at Banagher. Shorter was able to persuade Nichols to part with the collection of manuscripts, or the bulk of the collection, which he'd brought back from Haworth. And Shorter wrote, "Money was, I thought, not too plentiful in the Banagher household. And when I offered Mr. Nichols some hundreds of pounds for certain little books of the Brontes with the rights of publication, he not unnaturally accepted my suggestion. They had been tied up in a brown paper parcel for 40 years, and had I not gone to Banagher, he assured me he intended to burn them all. The friend with whom I acted became the possessor of these documents, I retaining only the copyright in them." So the friend with whom he acted was, of course, Thomas Wise, and he is a fascinating character who played quite an important role in the Bronte story. He was born into a fairly poor working class background in Gravesend. His father was a tobacconist, and he'd kind of made his first moves into the rare book trade as a child, buying up second-hand books from Barrows and learning to pick out the bargains. And by 1892, he'd completely reinvented himself as a man of letters, and probably one of the main collectors of his generation, who went on to become president of the Bibliographical Society. So Nichols and Nussey had parted with their letters and manuscripts and placed their trust in Wise and Shorter. But unknown to them and to the elite members of the Bibliographical Society, Wise had established a lucrative market in manufacturing pre-first editions of famous books, which he passed off as having been privately printed by the authors themselves for circulation privately amongst their family and friends. So he was producing things that couldn't be compared with an actual first edition and found to be frauds. So he would gradually release these pamphlets and books onto the rare book market, sometimes donating a copy to important national collections. And in one instance, he actually paid £52 at a Sotheby's sale for one of his own pamphlets to kind of inflate the prices. And he would tell people that he dealt with that he'd actually acquired the sheets for these publications following the demolition of a publisher's warehouse, and he'd been offered this opportunity to buy the printed sheets. I think it's a measure of what a charismatic rogue he actually was. That in one instance, because bearing in mind most of the authors whose works he was producing these pamphlets for were either dead or they were very elderly and in poor health. But in one instance, he managed to get William Morris to actually inscribe a copy of one of his own works, which had been forged. So this dubious pair now owned the bulk of the Brontes' manuscripts and letters, and many of their books, as well as the copyright in them. And soon afterwards, they set to work in churning out expensive limited editions of the Brontes' works, which were intended purely to make money. They were not about making the manuscripts accessible in any way. And with regard to the originals, Nichols and Nussey were both quite shocked to discover that their precious letters and manuscripts were within a year appearing in auction houses. For many of the manuscripts, they were actually split to increase the money that could be made potentially. And the manuscripts were encased in handsome Riviere leather bindings before being sold on mainly to collectors in America. So this was something that Ellen Nussey was particularly shocked and upset by. And we can see from acquisition records at the parsonage that while Wise made token gifts to the museum, usually of Branwell items which were of lesser importance, one of his associates was actually selling a lot of material to the museum. And ironically, Wise was elected president of the Bronte Society in 1926, something we don't really talk about very much nowadays. And ironically, when you think about how much material he'd got his hands on, when he actually died in 1937, there were only 7 Charlotte Bronte manuscripts still surviving amongst his collection, which was known as the Ashley Library, and it was acquired for the nation. Ellen Nussey's attempts to hold Wise to account proved ineffectual. But in the end, his carelessness and greed got the better of him. There were new developments in the analysis of paper and typography, being able to date the paper. And in 1934, just 3 years before his death, Wise was exposed as a forger and his reputation was ruined. Nobody's ever got quite to the bottom of the damage that he inflicted on the sort of chronological integrity of the Bronte manuscripts, which are scattered far and wide. We might have 12 pages of a Charlotte Bronte story in the parsonage. There might be 5 more in Texas, or 6 pages in New York, and it's working out which pages belong to which story and then trying to transcribe the tiny handwriting that they were written in. So towards the end of the 19th century, as those who had known the Brontes passed away, items of Bronteana started to appear in sales. The selling off of Bronte material started to gather momentum. Former servants and people who'd been associated with the family and once who'd guarded their Bronte treasures died, and their relatives were often prepared to sell if the price was right. So it was in response to this situation of Bronte material changing hands, often going overseas, that led to the formation of the Bronte Society in 1893. It's my plug for the society. It was formed by a small group of dedicated Bronte admirers, mainly from Yorkshire, who recognised that if something didn't happen, the chance to put together a collection and make it accessible to form a museum would be gone. So they formed the society, and they actually achieved their first goal of opening a museum within 2 years. And this is the very first Bronte museum they opened in Haworth, the top of the steep main street. By 1927, the Society's collection had outgrown the cramped museum at the top of Main Street. And at this point, the church trustees announced they would be willing to sell Haworth Parsonage, which had been the home of the Brontes from 1820 up until Patrick's death in 1861. At this point, I think the Bronte Society had £50 of funds in the bank, and the asking price for the parsonage was £3,000. But a local boy made good, Sir James Roberts, who'd made a fortune in the textile industry, came to the Society's help, and he actually purchased the parsonage and provided the money to set it up as a museum and a centre for Bronte research. And this was the day on the 4th of August 1928 when thousands of people arrived in Haworth to witness Sir James hand over the title deeds to the Bronte Society and to witness the official opening of the Bronte Parsonage Museum. So the acquisition of the parsonage was hugely important to the Bronte Society. Owners of Bronte memorabilia identified it as being the rightful home for their Bronte treasures. And you can tell from the acquisition records that huge amounts of Bronte furniture, household items were all donated or sold at this period. And later that year, a large collection of over 300 rare books and manuscripts which had been put together by the American multimillionaire Henry Houston Burnell arrived from America. Burnell's collection was one of the finest ever put together and included Emily Bronte's writing desk and many manuscripts and letters, along with books which had been owned by the family and first editions of their work. This is one of the items in the Burnell collection, and it's a tiny, tiny diary paper written by Emily Bronte and Anne Bronte in 1834. If you can think about a match, cook's matches, those boxes that they come in, it's about that size. And it's just a really it gives you a snapshot of life in the parsonage as it's happening. So Emily's writing about who's come into the room, the conversations that they've had. And she wrote quite a few of these diary papers. We've now got 4 in our collection. And she always ends by speculating on what they're going to be doing in 4 years' time when the next diary paper is due. They're like little time capsules, really. But for some reason with this paper, she's actually jumped ahead. And she goes on to say, Anne and I say, I wonder what we shall be like, and what we shall be, and where we shall be, if all goes on well in the year 1874, in which year I shall be in my 57th year, Anne will be going in her 55th year, Branwell will be going in his 58th year, and Charlotte in her 59th year. Hoping we shall all be well, at that time, we close our paper, Emily and Anne. So it makes it very poignant nowadays when we know that none of the Brontes made it into 1874. And this is another Charlotte Bronte manuscript from the Burnell collection. And again, it's about the same size. And this is part of a manuscript by Charlotte Bronte, which is known as the History of the Year. And it was dated March the 12th, 1829. And this is Charlotte recording a really key moment in the family's history. And she writes, Papa bought Branwell some soldiers at Leeds. When Papa came home, it was night and we were in bed. So next morning, Branwell came to our door with a box of soldiers. Emily and I jumped out of bed and I snatched up one and exclaimed, this is the Duke of Wellington, it shall be mine. When I said this, Emily likewise took one and said it should be hers. When Anne came down, she took one also. Mine was the prettiest of the whole and perfect in every part. Emily's was a grave-looking fellow. We called him Gravy. Anne's was a queer little thing, very much like herself, poor Anne. And he was called Waiting Boy. Branwell chose Bonaparte. So that's like a key moment in the Brontes' history when they are presented with this box of soldiers and they all pick out a soldier and give them names and characters, and they actually created an imaginary world around the soldiers, which got more and more sophisticated and complex as they got older. And there is actually another account of this episode in another collection written by Branwell Bronte, but in his version there's none of this sisters snatching up soldiers. In his version he allows his sisters to select a soldier. So given the nature of their dispersal, it's incredible that so many of the Brontes' personal possessions have returned to their original home at Haworth. And the story of how the Society's collection has grown and developed is a fascinating one. The collection is, of course, a great scholarly resource, which has given important insights into the Brontes' lives and works. In addition to the parsonage itself, which is a Grade 1 listed building, the Society's collection includes letters, manuscripts, books, drawings, paintings, sewing boxes and implements, samplers, costume, furniture, china, and other household items. And I think all these artefacts possess an ability to bring the members of the family to life. Something about the fact that they're all so ordinary. And it's interesting to know that one of the earliest visitors who came to the Bronte Society's first museum in Haworth was actually Virginia Woolf. She arrived in Haworth in 1904, and her very first published piece was an account of her visit for the Guardian newspaper. She's quite rude about Haworth, I've got to say, and she paints a very unflattering picture of the Bronte Society's first museum, which she likens to a mausoleum. But then she's brought up short by the sight of one of Charlotte Bronte's dresses, possibly the one you can see here. And she recorded the most touching case, so touching that one hardly feels reverent in one's gaze, is that which contains the personal relics, the dresses and shoes of the dead woman. The natural fate of such things is to die before the body that wore them. And because these, trifling and transient though they are, have survived, Charlotte Bronte, the woman, comes to life. And this is actually a dress that Charlotte wore on one of her London visits when she attended, or she was visited by the novelist William Thackeray. There are many more Bronte items that we're aware of that are in private ownership. Some of these are known from descriptions in sale catalogues and letters and contemporary accounts, and there are many more out there waiting to be discovered. One of the interesting things about working at the parsonage, you never know what the post is going to bring. And in 2000, I received a letter from an elderly lady which contained photocopies of 5 drawings believed to be by Charlotte Bronte, which she'd inherited from her grandmother. And her grandmother had been nurse to a Bronte collector called William Law of Littleborough, who was a well-known collector of Bronteana. And over the years, her grandmother, who'd acted as his nurse, had been given items with a Bronte connection, which she'd given to members of her family to mark important birthdays. She was too frail to bring her collection in, so she arranged for her nephew to bring some of the items she owned. And amongst them, there was Emily's needlework box, Charlotte's travelling chest. There was a brass dog collar, very similar to the ones you can see on display at the parsonage. And there was also a pistol marked PBB, which had clearly belonged to Branwell Bronte. A couple of days later, the nephew phoned us and asked us if we'd received anything unusual in the post that morning. And it turned out that his grandmother, prompted by our interest in the pistol, had popped another one that she owned in the post. And there we have it. So it's an antique firearm with a lethal bayonet attachment, which is believed to be the one that Emily Bronte described in Wuthering Heights. And it arrived through the post in a jiffy bag. Another item that was acquired in 2015 is the Bronte family's dining table. And this is actually the table in the home of its owners. It had been in their family for several generations, and they always had their Christmas dinner on it. But it got to the point, the couple that owned it were quite elderly, and they'd got 4 adult children, and this was their biggest financial asset, was worth more than their house. So they offered to sell it by private treaty to the parsonage, and they gave us a year to fundraise, and we got a huge grant from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, and we were able to bring the table back to Haworth. Another item is a little book by Charlotte Bronte. This came up for auction in November 2019 at a Paris auction house. And this is one of the iconic little books made by Charlotte Bronte that was intended to be read, if you like, by the toy soldiers. And this is a really ambitious facsimile magazine. It's meant to look like a printed book. It's got reviews and poems, stories, even advertisements in the back, you know, all the things you'd expect to find in a printed magazine. This magazine, this tiny book, first came to light in 2011 when it turned up in a sale at Sotheby's in London with an estimate of £200,000 to £300,000. The Bronte Society got a huge grant, again from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, who were seen as being the fund of last resort. And we also got donations from literature lovers all around the world. So we went to that auction with over £600,000 and we were outbid. It was a terrible day. And the little book was actually acquired by the Aristotle collection in Paris. It went on display briefly in their museum in Paris, but we were told there was something slightly dubious about this collection and that the little book would come back on the market. And sure enough, in 2014, the entire Aristotle collection was impounded. And they came under investigation for fraud and money laundering. So in 2019, we were advised that the little book would be released back onto the Paris market, and this time we were able to bring it back to Haworth, where it can be enjoyed for future generations. And this little book was part of a set of 6. It's the second series of the Young Men's magazine. We already had 4 in the museum collection. We got number 5 here, but we always knew that the 6th little book was part of the collection of William Law, who I mentioned earlier, who'd been giving things away to his nurse. And in 2021, very early in the year, we were advised by Sotheby's that the law collection had all come to light. It had been lost for many years. Nobody knew what had happened to it. And we were offered 7 of the Charlotte Bronte manuscripts that were in the collection, including one of the little books, for a really eye-watering price. And for a museum just coming out of lockdown, it was way beyond our resources. So we decided instead to put our energy into kind of generating an awareness of what happens when literary heritage like this is kind of hiked onto the markets. This was an amazingly important collection put together by William Law, who was a manufacturer who lived about 20 miles away from Haworth in a big house called Onresfield. So the collection is sometimes known as the Law Collection, but quite often known as the Onresfield Library. And it included works by Robert Burns, Sir Walter Scott, Byron, Gaskell, a whole host, Jane Austen, a whole host of literary celebrities. After William Law died in 1901, the collection went briefly to his brother and then to their nephew, Sir Alfred Law. And he died in 1939, and nobody knew what had happened to the collection after that. So when it came to light, it was a really, really big deal. And of course, if you do sort of hike collections like this onto the international market, they're going to disappear. All these things are going to disappear into collections overseas. And the Bronte Society was at the forefront of a really quite ambitious campaign, not just to save the Bronte material, but to save the whole library for the nation. This was a consortium. We formed a consortium which was spearheaded by the Friends of the National Libraries, and we were able to persuade Sotheby's, who were acting as agents for the vendors, to take down the 3 sales that they'd planned and give us time to raise the asking price of £15 million, which we managed to do. So this astonishingly rich collection of material, which also included hundreds of printed books and first editions, it's now been allocated to museums and libraries throughout the UK who will all be able to benefit from it. But at the heart of it is this amazing collection of Bronte material. And a lot of this material has now come back to Haworth. And some of it will be on display at the parsonage next year, and some of it will be part of an exhibition at the Brotherton Library at Leeds. So do go along and see it if you get a chance. Now, I'm now going to talk a little bit about films, which might seem a bit of a change of subject. But film and TV adaptations of the Brontes' lives, as well as documentaries and other TV coverage, have always played a huge part in the history of the Brontë Parsonage Museum. All film adaptations reflect cultural and social change, and as a sideline to filming, we're able to collect material relating to all these films. We've got a huge drama archive at the parsonage, which is considered to be quite a resource for scholars. In the past, it was collected on a fairly ad hoc basis, but now we've got some really quite valuable material in it. The first film adaptation of Wuthering Heights was a silent film made in Haworth in 1920, and this is a still from it. So it was all made on location. It was a really ambitious attempt to capture the whole book. with 3 different actors playing Heathcliff throughout his life. This is Cathy's deathbed scene in the film. And a few years back, we were able to purchase the screenplay, which belonged to, it was the director's own copy with annotations by him, which was quite a prize because the film itself has not survived. So all that does survive are the stills and the material that we've got in the collection. And this was actually, it was scripted by, even though it was a silent film, there was still a script. And it was scripted by Elliot Stannard, who's one of the forgotten greats of the British film industry, who was a mentor for Alfred Hitchcock. And then in 1939, MGM released Wuthering Heights, starring Laurence Olivier and Merle Oberon, a film that was definitely not made in Haworth. But it attracted an audience of 22 million viewers. And then 1944, you've got the release of Jane Eyre with Orson Welles, and all these films had a huge impact on visitor numbers at the parsonage. 1970 was probably the biggest period for films. There was a new film of Jane Eyre with George C. Scott and Susanna York, Wuthering Heights with Timothy Dalton and Anna Calder Marshall. And also the Railway Children film was made in Haworth in the early 1970s, and the parsonage featured briefly in that. And this is the cover of the Radio Times with another TV drama, The Brontes of Haworth, which featured Alfred Burke as Patrick Bronte and a very young Michael Kitchen who played Branwell. And visitor figures to the parsonage, which had been steadily increasing throughout all these years, reached a staggering 221,497 people in the year that the Brontes of Haworth was shown on TV. So never underestimate the power of film. And today, filming requests continue to arrive at the parsonage. We've seen quite an increase in recent years, and filming taking place in a Grade 1 listed house with a collection of really fragile artefacts on display can be quite stressful. In 2015, we worked with the BBC on an immersive history documentary where it was called Being the Brontes, and it featured 3 presenters who represented each of the sisters. And the idea was that they would live like a Bronte for a week, and unfortunately that meant that I had to as well, because one of them wanted to stay overnight, and we had to set up a reproduction bed in the parsonage, and I had to sleep on a very lumpy futon in the next door room. And then in 2016, we worked with the BBC again on the Sally Wainwright drama To Walk Invisible, which involved teams of production people working at the parsonage every day, measuring the flagstones, recreating the parsonage as it might have looked in the 1840s on Penistone Hill behind the real parsonage. Became a really popular walking destination for everybody in Haworth. If you look at this image, this is Haworth in the Bronte period with the parsonage without any of its extensions, and the old church, and no trees in the churchyard. And these were the sisters from To Walk Invisible in their recreated parsonage dining room. This is the set of the parsonage hallway that they created, which is really good. They went to a huge amount of trouble to get all the detail right. But as we're in Scarborough, I thought I'd end with talking a little bit about some items from the collection which relate to Anne Bronte, who of course loved Scarborough and is buried here. 2020 marked the bicentenary of Anne Bronte's birth, and we'd planned a really big exhibition to celebrate Anne's life and to try and get her known to a wider audience. But unfortunately, it was all forestalled by the pandemic and the fact that just, I think, 3 weeks after we opened the exhibition, the whole museum had to close. So Anne is the forgotten Bronte. She's usually compared unfavourably with her two sisters. She's often portrayed as gentle and mild, although her second novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, was considered by critics to be unfit for lady readers, and today is considered extraordinary for its impassioned treatment of women's rights. So this is a letter that Anne Bronte wrote, and in fact it is her last letter. And in the letter she's writing to Charlotte's friend Ellen Nussey, requesting her presence on a trip that she's making to Scarborough with Charlotte. And she's quite bravely confronting the prospect that she might not survive in this letter. But she goes on to talk about the plans, the schemes that she's got in her head. Humble and limited indeed, she writes, but still she shouldn't like them to come to nothing, and herself to have lived to so little purpose. It's quite a moving letter. It's one of the things in the collection which I find the most moving and the most fascinating. We've got a portrait of Anne Bronte produced by her sister Charlotte. I think it's one of 3 we've got in the museum collection. And the museum collection continues to grow. So apart from the Onresfield library material, which came back this year, and a little Charlotte Bronte book, which was purchased at the New York Book Fair for nearly £1 million and donated to the Brontë Parsonage Museum. I was contacted earlier this year by a woman in Surrey who'd inherited a Charlotte Bronte letter from her grandfather. She'd had it for several years. It'd been sitting on a bookshelf in her beautiful Surrey home in a brown envelope, which presumably had been posted out from Sotheby's to her grandfather in the 1920s. Her grandfather was Dr. Stanley Fox Linton, who'd lived at the old mill at Cloughton. I think I got that right. I've been told I'll be thrown out if I mispronounce it. And he was a collector of books and possibly bought the letter because it had a Scarborough connection. It was written at number 2 Cliff, Scarborough, on the 27th of May 1849, the day before Anne Bronte died in Scarborough. And in the letter, Charlotte writes, "As Anne sits at the window, she can look down on the sea. She says if she could breathe more freely, she would be comfortable at this moment, but she cannot breathe freely." She describes in the letter the difficult journey from Haworth to York and then to Scarborough, which was achieved through the kindness of strangers who offered to lift her in and out of the carriages and over the railway lines. It would have been a terribly difficult and painful journey for Anne Bronte, who by that point was incredibly weak. And when you look at the original letter, I'm really sorry, I didn't have an image of it, the letter, which it betrays a new level of meaning, because Charlotte's normally perfect, elegant handwriting. It's quite blotted, the pressure on the paper's very uneven, and it's like tremors of grief, you know, in her handwriting. It's got a black border because Charlotte was still in mourning for her sister Emily, who died the previous December, and her brother Branwell, who died the previous September. In the space of 9 months, she lost 3 of her siblings. The letter is on display at the parsonage, and it will be next year as well. So if you do get a chance to visit Haworth, do come along and have a look at some of the things that I've talked about today. And that brings me to the end of my talk, but I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody's got any.
Questions for that? Oh, there's such a bit of hands there, wasn't there?
Have you seen the recent film?
Do you know, I knew somebody was going to ask me that, and I can honestly say, no, I haven't seen it. I've not been able to attend any of the screenings as yet. So I'm going to go to see it with an open mind. Have you seen it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I spent hours afterwards trying to figure out what was real and what was fake.
Yeah.
So I'd like to give you an answer.
Well, I think you've just got to bear in mind it's not a documentary. It is a sort of creative reimagining. So I've heard good reports and bad, but there is quite a... We don't know very much about Emily Bronte, that is the thing. So people, biographers, filmmakers kind of rush to fill in the gaps. So I'm not sure what I will make of it when I see it, but I'm going to go with a kind of I'm going to try and keep an open mind about it. There's a lady here.
Can I ask, is it right that they all died of consumption, or is that not true?
Yeah, they all died of TB, apart from Charlotte Bronte, who is believed to have died. There are hundreds of articles about Charlotte's death, but it's generally accepted that she died in early pregnancy from a condition called hyperemesis, which is excessive vomiting in the early stages.
And they didn't have any TB drugs available?
No. The sea air was believed to be beneficial, which is one of the reasons that Anne was so keen to come to Scarborough.
Right. Thank you.
I know that they were very old, but was Charlotte ever photographed?
That's a difficult one. There was a photograph which became established as being Charlotte Bronte quite some time ago. We had a copy of it in our collection. It was found initially in the archives of the National Portrait Gallery, and it was part of an archive that related to a photographer called Emery Walker, who used to supply images for book publication. And in his card index, it was said to be CB within a year of her death. Which wasn't enough in itself to ascribe it to being Charlotte Bronte. But then a few years later, a woman, Mrs. Gordon, died and left her collection to the parsonage. And she was the great-granddaughter of Charlotte Bronte's publisher. And there was a copy of this same carte de visite in her papers, which again said CB within a year of her death. So it became kind of established that that was Charlotte Bronte. But nowadays it tends to, people think it's actually Ellen Nussey, Charlotte's friend Ellen Nussey. So it's still hotly debated. I've got to say people are desperate to know what the Brontes really looked like, and probably every week I get someone contacting me about a portrait or a photograph. And if it's a Victorian woman with a centre parting, they think it's Charlotte Bronte. And if it's three women together, and if one of them's got a book or a pen, then it's the Bronte sisters. And I spend a lot of time trying to kind of examine these images. So there isn't any image that any photograph that we can definitely say is one of the Bronte. Apart from Patrick, there were several images taken of him late in life.
Is there a particular gap in your collection that you want to fill? Is there something in the original catalogue that you'd love to fill?
There are a lot of things out there that we know are still out there that I would love to get our hands on. I don't think we've not got many gaps. I mean, mainly in material relating to Emily and Anne, but it just doesn't survive. I mean, the portrait that I used right at the beginning of the images, the three sisters, that belongs to the National Portrait Gallery. So we don't actually possess an image of the three sisters together, which would be nice to have. There was a letter which came to auction a few years ago, and it was a letter by Charlotte which accompanied the manuscript of Jane Eyre. And that's a really iconic letter that we'd love to have. But I mean, we try and collect everything. But nowadays, the prices are so eye-wateringly high, that Bronte items achieve. So unfortunately, we often get outbid by collectors.
Can I have a follow-up question? How did you authenticate the table?
Sorry?
The table, that lovely...
Oh, yeah, yeah.
How were you absolutely sure it was the authentic?
Remember the image of the sale catalogue that I showed you, the handwritten sale catalogue? That was one of the items that was sold in 1861, and it gave us the name of the purchaser. So we've been able to sort of track the provenance, because it had been in the same family for generations. So we were pretty sure it is the original table.
How much did you go for then, originally?
In 2015, I can't...
When it was sold...
Oh, right, okay. It was probably under £2, I think. I can't remember, I'd need to double check, but it wasn't much. Nothing in the sale realised.
It went for 3 days.
It was over 2 days, and it wasn't widely advertised. So it was mainly local people going along with an eye to a bargain, rather than trying to get a Bronte treasure. I mean, I've got to say, Haworth people were not that impressed with the Bronte sisters and their literary fame at that point, at that point in time. So they all the things sold for fairly low prices.
Jen?
I'm just speaking of nosy, actually. You say you've worked here for 34 years. What's your original background? Is it literature or art history?
My degree is mainly in art history, and I started off working part-time in the parsonage, and then I had worked in a library. So I got kind of brought in to do some part-time work in the parsonage research library, and it just kind of grew from there, really. And I've had various job titles over the 34 years.
Yeah.
How do you preserve all those delicate pieces of paper?
We've got a strong room where they're all stored, and we monitor humidity, light levels, all those kind of things. When you go around the parsonage, it can feel quite gloomy, and it's because we keep the lights at a certain level to avoid damage. And we also change items that are on display fairly regularly to avoid, overexposure to the light. We store things in acid-free folders and files, and we do use a paper conservator. If there's anything that we're concerned about, we consult a a professional conservator.
So you go to him quite regularly to check that nothing's
Yeah.
deteriorated?
Yeah.
It's a big job.
It is a big job, and every January we check all the furniture as well, and we keep regular reports of any signs of damage or anything that we're concerned about.
You referred to many wonderful pieces which are going to be on show from next year.
Yeah.
Will that be from January?
We'll be closed in January, just opening at weekends. So everything, all the new displays will be ready in February, from the 1st of February onwards.
And how are you going to decide what to replace?
We've always got an exhibition planned, so that changes every year, and we've always got a kind of scheme in our heads about what we're going to do from year to year. So next year we're also going to feature a lot of the material in our collection that relates to Emily Bronte, to kind of exploit a lot of the interest that there's been in the film that we were talking about earlier.
So the 2-day sale,
Yeah.
where things were let go at really tiny prices, what was the point of the sale?
Well, because Arthur Bell Nichols had hoped that he'd be offered the living of Haworth and that he'd be able to remain at the parsonage. And when that didn't happen, he decided to return to Ireland. And he took all the really precious things, the really personal items such as jewellery, the dress that Charlotte had worn for her wedding, the manuscripts, some of the, all the really personal things, and all the household items were all sold at auction because he couldn't really carry them with him.
So it's more a case of getting rid of them than making
Yeah.
money out of them.
Yeah, there were also quite a few Branwell oil paintings in the sale, and it has to be said that Mr. Nichols didn't have any great love for Branwell or his work, and a lot of his paintings were included.